Good evening, Chair Moon and esteemed members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Delegate Deborah Davis. I'm from District 28 in Charles County. I'm here to present HB 280 entitled Cannabis-Related Offenses, Civil Penalties. This past November, the legislature took the bold step of presenting the legalization of adult use cannabis as a referendum. Marylanders overwhelmingly voted to support legalization of cannabis in our state. They entrusted us to create the framework for legalization. It is our responsibility at this time to do our part in stopping mass incarceration, minimizing police interactions, pretextual police stops, loss of employment, underemployment, excessive fines, and loss of generational wealth, which has debilitated over-policed neighborhoods related to the use and possession of cannabis. HB 280 aims to replace criminal penalties with alternatives of reasonable fines, rehabilitation programs, and community service. It centers our citizens' safety and equality and quality of life as the focal point for the proposed legislation. I submit to you that these policies and practices of incarceration and excessive, if these policies of practices of incarceration and excessive fines continue, we have failed our communities. I respectfully request a favorable report on House Bill 208. I want to make a note that it is a Black Caucus, this bill is a Black Caucus priority, and I want to turn it over to the people with the boots on the ground. Thank you so much.
Good evening, Chair Moon and members of the committee. My name is Yanet Amanuel, Public Policy Director with the ACLU of Maryland, here in full support of HB 280. In 2014, the General Assembly decriminalized the possession of 10 grams or less of marijuana, in large part because of the disparate enforcement of marijuana laws on Black people. Similarly, this last November, Maryland voters decided that recreational use of marijuana should no longer be criminalized. However, simply legalizing will not fix this issue. Criminal penalties for marijuana-related offenses are still on the books. Under current law, possession over the civil use limit and possession with intent to distribute are misdemeanor offenses and carries a penalty of 6 months to 3 years of incarceration. A criminal record can and does create a barrier to employment for many Marylanders. A misdemeanor conviction also hinders an individual's access to stable housing and a range of public benefits. With higher conviction rates of persons of color, they bear the brunt of collateral consequences stemming from misdemeanor convictions. Exclusion from the job market, stable housing, and countless other crucial services perpetuate a cycle of imprisonment plaguing communities of color. And without gainful employment and stable housing, individuals are forced to livelihoods of criminality. Last year, the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy released data on sentencing trends in Maryland courts. And just really quickly share some stats with you. Between 2017 to 2021, Black people made up almost 68% of the people sentenced with misdemeanor or felony offenses, and Black people served longer time for these offenses, and almost 50% of them that were sentenced, this was their first offense. And lastly, I'll leave you this. Furthermore, according to the racial impact statement that the Department of Legislative Services provided, a total of marijuana-related charges in 2020, only 23% led to convictions, and Black people accounted for 52% of those convictions. So for that and all the other reasons in our written statement, we urge a favorable report on HB 280. Thank you.
All right, good evening. Dayvon Love, Director, Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You know, the notion of the inherent criminality of people of African descent is ubiquitous in the American collective consciousness. I don't have the time to go into all the historical markers to substantiate that claim, but when we look at the past 50 years of the policies of the war on drugs and the politicization of this inherent notion of criminality, we can see that law enforcement has become dependent on cannabis prohibition policies as a crime-fighting tool. And unfortunately, when we look at, for instance, in the state of Maryland, the Judiciary provided some numbers for 2018 and 2019 that in those 2 years combined, in the blackest jurisdictions in the state, Prince George's County, over 2,700 charges for marijuana possession, cannabis possession, and Baltimore City, slightly over 1,400. So it's clear that law enforcement is dependent on, relies on cannabis prohibition policies. The challenge is that there is no evidence that cannabis prohibition policy is an effective public safety strategy. In fact, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement on the 17th, I don't know if they testified here, the Commissioner, the State's Attorney, but they testified over in the Senate. And one of the slides provided by Director Jackson of the Muncie office says that only 14.5% of the homicides in the Western District were connected to illicit drug activity. So if we take that as a reasonable sample size, what that leads us to believe is that cannabis prohibition policy actually doesn't square with the data as to what precipitates the violence in the community. And so I wanted to make it a point to emphasize this because law enforcement will continue to talk about them needing this in order to effectively address public safety. Last thing I want to say, in California, when cannabis was legalized, one of the things that was urged by many of the major beneficiaries of the industry, many of them not black or brown, they urged lawmakers to crack down on cannabis prohibition policy in the name of trying to do something about the black market. And so the exposure of people of African descent to the criminal justice system under the guise of public safety is what exacerbates these problems in the first place. And so with that, we urge a favorable report on House Bill 280. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here. My name is Michelle Hall, and I'm an attorney with the Office of the Public Defender, testifying today in favor of HB 280, which would eliminate the criminal penalties for possession of cannabis and possession with intent to distribute cannabis, and we urge a favorable report. The goal of this bill is simple: to ensure that in a Maryland where cannabis will be legal, that individuals do not continue to suffer the harsh collateral consequences of a criminal conviction for engaging in the cannabis market outside of the legalized scheme. This bill really strikes the appropriate balance between the state's interest in regulating the marketplace while not criminalizing individuals for engaging in the very same practices that will be an economic boon for the state. The civil penalties in this bill are proportionate and appropriate responses to cannabis possession and distribution after legalization. Perhaps most importantly, I would really emphasize, as my colleague Yanet did, the racial equity impact note that makes clear how Black individuals are disproportionately arrested and prosecuted for cannabis possession under the current regime. This is the reality that I see every day as a public defender. When defending cases in Prince George's County, I never had a marijuana case from the University of Maryland, but there were plenty originating in the Black neighborhoods in the county. This will only continue when legalization becomes a reality later this year without this bill. Legalization means nothing if we leave in place the tools that have led to the disproportionate arrests, convictions, and mass incarceration of Black people and continue a two-tiered system of injustice. We urge this committee to issue a favorable report, and thank you.